All right. So this week, today you had to have the DBQ done. Some people have just opened it, and I think that's because I put the grades in. So if you have not completed that already, please go and actually attempt the DBQ. Again, as long as you attempt it, I don't care if you score a 0 or a 10. You get full credit as long as you actually attempt to do this, so that way we can get you better for the actual exam. Now, on the DBQ, you can find it in the assignments tab in the Google Drive. I went over that before. I showed you guys how to get to that point. So I'm just going to talk about the DBQ for a little while and then answer questions. So the DBQ is here, the Unit 3 document-based question. This is on everything. And here it's essentially from 1450 to 1750 in relation to land-based empires. Now, even though it is land-based empires, you will notice one of the documents is from Japan, which doesn't seem like it makes sense because they're an island. But it's important to remember that during this time period, Japan solely was an empire on its own shores. It did not have other colonies and things that had not yet taken over the Korean Peninsula. So it was still just all about how it handled power within its own borders, right? So the documents are all in here. There's a bunch of stuff. And then if you noticed this morning, I posted essentially a rubric to score this. The way in which that is done is pretty simple. I posted up, if I can get this to actually stop dragging that up. There we go. I posted up a scoring rubric. I went through all of this and I gave what I think is an appropriate amount of information for you to be able to self-score your DBQ. All right, so I'm going to read this, go over it, and then talk about it for a bit. So this document will help you self-evaluate and score your own DBQ. In this document, you will find examples and ideas of things that will get you the points for this prompt. This is not all-encompassing. So if you have individual questions, please ask them. I am here every day during this time period, but also from 1 to 3. And if you send me a message, I will get back to you immediately. So please ask questions. You are only going to get better if you work on it and practice. This is the only thing on the test. So this is the only thing you need to study and work for the class. Put the time in now, right? All the other review portions are just so you have the information to get the points for this. All of the review documents are going to help you with 4 out of the 10 points. Sourcing and outside evidence. To a lesser extent, contextualization, because ultimately you kind of have to just know that part in relation to it. But at least 4, if not 5 of the points are going to be based off of your background knowledge and information, right? The rest of it is up to actually analyzing and breaking down these documents and building a cohesive argument, right? So the prompt was develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which rulers of land-based empires were able to consolidate their power in the period 1450 to 1750. So for the first thing that you should have done, setting the scene with your background info with contextualization, you need to talk about things not in the time period, right? This is extremely important. If you talked about anything that is important during the 1500s or during the 1600s or the early part of the 1700s, you are not going to get that point, right? Contextualization has to be from outside of the time period. Now, this essay lends itself entirely to a compare and contrast essay, right? There are 3 types of essays that you can essentially write in the entirety of the DBQs. There's causation, and there's causation. There's causation, cause and effect. Then there's change over time, continuity and change over time, and then there's comparing and contrasting. They all start with a C. Right. So this is extremely important to figure out right out the gate, because if you told me how these empires changed over time, you're not going to be able to do anything well with this prompt. This is directly a compare and contrast essay, right? So for contextualization, I put some things here. There are a couple that are more explicit, other things that are not. So you can discuss the Crusades, the impact that they had on the relationship between the church and the Islamic empires, or the Europeans in general, and Asian areas, especially the Middle East, right? That happened prior to the time period. It puts a huge stress on it, and it directly relates to two of the documents, right? The next one, you could discuss the feudal system. That certainly existed prior to this. The Magna Carta, however, though, gets signed before the time period starts, essentially ending feudalism. So ultimately, the feudal system in Europe versus the feudal system in Japan. Now, it's important to note, if you only talked about the feudal system in Japan, you're not going to get the point here. This document covers the feudal system in Japan. It certainly was existing during this time period, and we'll talk more about that when we get to document 4. But you had to compare the European feudal system to the Japanese, or just limiting it to the European feudal system. That alone would have been okay. You can talk about merit-based ranking within the government by the Mongols. The Mongols spread this idea and this concept during the 1200s, so you certainly can reference them, right? The mandate of heaven when it comes to China, you can bring that up. The divine right of kings in Europe, you have that kind of happening early on in there. That both of those things do occur during this time period as well, but they are founded prior to it. So as long as you talk about the founding of that and the idea that the heavens need to be pleased with a ruler as long as the ruling class is behaving the way it needs to, and that had existed for thousands of years, then that's good. If you talk about the fact that in European countries, the king essentially was chosen by God, and tie that back to the actual religious tie-in with the government, that certainly can work. There are other things in here, but in all honesty, I don't really know what they would be, but you certainly could talk about other things as long as they're relatable. If you have specific questions about it, again, ask it. Type it up, send it to me in a message, come online on Zoom, talk to me about it. Whatever you need to do, please do it. This is the only thing on the test. We got to get better at it, right? So then we get into your thesis point. So since this is a compare and contrast, you need to hit on two major points. The documents in here are broken up. If you separated it between essentially Europeans versus Asians, you can break it down that way. You can also look at each document individually and build an argument based on an actual idea rather than a location. So some of the ideas here. So the way in which your social status is determined in different empires is something you could talk about, making up essentially the court to the king, however they hold power. The way in which warriors could make a living, that also kind of factors into this. The way in which power was distributed to the nobles in different empires, that's going to be the easiest and most direct one. The way in which the military was treated and the way in which soldiers were paid by their lords. All of these directly relate to the way in which these rulers consolidated and held on to their power, right? Some of them used the military to control the people. Others used local lords to control everybody. But ultimately, they kind of fall into either one of those sides, where they either delegate their power and hand it out to people, or they keep all of it and basically become dictators, right? So it really only went one way or the other. It's important to realize where each one falls on this. So I broke down each thing in here, and I started with sourcing for the document. Then I did evidence from the document, and then outside evidence that you could have used for this. You will see some of the documents are easier to pull these points from than others, right? So for document 1, sourcing for document 1, the document is from a missionary in the Catholic Church to the Pope. This tells us that it's essentially a scouting report for the church. He's gathering information and reporting it back to the Pope in an official capacity. This is a private correspondence. It's not meant for anyone else to read. The way in which it is written is made to make the Pope aware that the Shah is ready militarily and should certainly not be taken lightly if he poses a threat. This document is also meant to make the Shah seem like a warlord, obsessed with weapons and warfare, so he seems more dangerous to the Pope. This is essentially a warning letter. It's saying, hey, if we are going to have a problem with them, this might actually be a bit of an issue. They've embraced all kinds of weapons. This dude is no joke, right? Sourcing from this document, it's important to note, right, that you have to say who is essentially writing it and why that is important, right? So it's important to note that nothing in here says, hey, watch out, they're going to come for us. But because we know that it's a private letter from a scout kind of sent out to gather information, we know that's what this is really getting at, right? We know that this is a report that is being made, and it's being directed to the Pope, to the person in charge, from an employee to a boss almost, right? So evidence from within this document that you could use. One thing that I need to stress, you need to make sure your evidence ties back to your thesis. And you need to make sure your thesis answers the prompt, right? So this prompt is the extent to which rulers of land-based empires are able to consolidate their power, right? So how did they consolidate their power? How did they keep all of the control of their empire in just their hands, right? So it's asking you how they were able to control everything. It's not asking you, oh, how did they embrace the military, right? That's not the question. The question is, how did they consolidate their power? How did they make sure nobody overthrew them, right? So within this, I said the document talks about how the military is paid year-round and constantly in training. It states that the reason the empire has expanded is because of the embrace of modern weapons and military might. It also shows how the ruler himself is the leader of the military and leads it directly. The king held on to his power by being the sole authority over the military, right? That's how he was able to hold on to his power. He was the leader of the military. He controlled everything with it, and he embraced all of the new weapons, mainly in this document, muskets. Right? Outside evidence that you could use. Pope Clement VIII is the one who called all Christians to defend Europe from the Ottoman Empire due to reports like these that painted all Islamic emperors as warlords. There's not much outside evidence that you can pull from this one. This one's rather difficult. So you will see that, well, for some of these, there's some really direct and easy things you can do for certain aspects. For others, there's just not. There's not a good way to source all these documents. There's not a good way to find outside evidence. You just kind of have to be able to figure out which ones you can do and run with those. Right? Document 2. So sourcing for document 2. This is from an ambassador to the King of Austria who is reporting back to the king. He is, much like in document 1, sending a formal scouting report back to his ruler who is eager to gain information before going to war. The audience is the king, and he's trying to inform him why going to war with the Turks would not be wise. His tone is such that he is warning the king more than just informing him, right? It's very similar to document 1 in that regard. For document 2, in terms of evidence, this document discusses merit-based positioning within the government. It also says that wealth and rank does not influence the decision to promote someone within the government. This document shows that birthrights are not a factor in your positioning in society either. This enables the Sultan to hold on to his power by surrounding himself with the most capable and best people for each position. It has nothing to do with their social status or what family they come from, right? If you want to compare and contrast this and build towards complexity, you could say that much unlike Europeans, right? Because in Austria, only in order to be in the king's court, your family had to have power. You had to be from another family of a prince or a duke or a duchess or something like that. Whereas in the Ottomans, it's whoever the best person for the job is got the job, right? So a totally different take on how you should decide who's in power where. For outside evidence, the Ottoman Empire was highly influenced by the Mongols, who also had merit-based positioning. The Ottoman Empire was founded after the Mongols invaded the Middle East, so they were able to take some of the strongest attributes and blend them into their own empire. If you talked about the Ottomans taking over the Byzantine Empire during this part, this would also work. I didn't write that down, but it's just kind of something that you could also use and say the Ottomans took over Constantinople and we're moving towards Europe, which is why the Austrian king was afraid of them, right? So the Ottomans have been pressing through, they had taken over part of Europe. You could certainly use that as outside evidence too. For document 3, this is a public announcement and decree from the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great. So this document was a law put into place that affected the nobility of Russia and was meant to be known to all. This document, like all decrees from a ruler, is extremely hard to get the sourcing point for. So I would recommend skipping this portion for this document. It is almost impossible to source a decree that was meant for everyone to read. It just is. Unless you can personally identify the reasoning behind why that decree was mandatory, or why they chose to use the language they do, or how they distributed it, don't try to source that document. Just move on. You're not going to get that point unless you have detailed, extensive knowledge about the specific event, right? So there's that part. For the evidence within this document lays out the requirements for nobility to be educated in order to obtain a rank or get married. Talks about that a lot. The reason that's important is for inheritance. Women were not able to inherit property, so the only way that you could essentially distribute your property and have any of your children inherit your goods is if they were able to get married and inherit it, right? This shows that the king held on to his power by educating those beneath him so that he could delegate more responsibility to those local minor nobles. It also showed that teachers and other educational roles could exist to benefit the ruler. This does show that birthright plays a major role on government positions, however, and that only the children of government officials and nobility get schooling, while freeholders or common people do not, right? So the way in which this king holds on to his power is by educating those under him, right? He wants to have more distributed power so that way his underlings can actually do all of the work and he can kind of sit back a little bit more and not have as much hands-on control. For outside evidence, Peter eliminated the old feudal system and instead had a centralized power. So while his local nobles had little power at all, he wanted to ensure that they actually were educated to control the people, right? He also established St. Petersburg as the national capital, consolidating all of the country's power in one city. This is the first time that there's a national capital in the Russian Empire, right? So that would be a piece of outside evidence that you can use. For document 4, this document is from the local ruler of a province in Japan. It also is a noble decree to the public, and much like the document before this, would be extremely hard to source without knowing that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a daimyo who was responsible for consolidating power and controlling the samurai class in feudal Japan. Yes, I had to look him up. No, I would not have attempted to source this document. I have no idea. This is a very concentrated, super isolated local incident, right? Where it's a single daimyo or local lord within all of Japan, and it's talking about a decree that he made that didn't really affect a lot of people other than the people directly tagged in this decree, which are the samurai and the common people, right? However, evidence within this document certainly could be useful. So this document shows how the local nobility controlled the military, in this case, the samurai, to consolidate their power. They used the military class to control the peasants, even going so far as to use this class to disarm the locals and take their weapons from them, right? So again, much like the Russian approach, the leader doesn't have all of the power, and instead they control the military, or in the Russian case, it was controlling the nobles and getting them educated. In this case, it's controlling the military underneath them, so that way they can go out and actually control the common people. Outside evidence for this. There's a lot that you could actually use. All of feudal Japan is usable for this in terms of outside evidence. There actually is a lot. We did talk about a lot of stuff in this. So you could actually use quite a bit of information here. So you can discuss the role of feudal lords in Japan, the role of the samurai in both the military and social hierarchy, or pointing to the unification of Japan under a single shogun instead of an emperor, and pointing out that the military is in fact in charge of this government, not the emperor, right? So all of those would be good things that you could use for outside evidence. For document 5, sourcing this document. This is a Chinese emperor during the Qing dynasty. Sourcing this picture is nearly impossible, as it's a portrait and only an in-depth analysis of this artistic approach and his posture or dress would work for sourcing. As a rule, don't try to source portraits unless art history is your calling. There's no way you're going to get the point for this unless you really can break down the actual art not just the person, but the art, and that's tough, right? In terms of evidence from this document shows how the Qing emperor dressed in a lavish colored robe, showing his divine right to rule. He's also posing as the Buddha did, showing his ability to intertwine religious rule with governmental rule. That's a major tie-in with the way that he's sitting, right? For outside evidence from this document, you could discuss how the Qing dynasty sought to be anti-Mongol after the Yuan dynasty. So this is, again, the dynasty that takes over right after the Mongols have left China. So after the Mongols essentially have had their dynasty overthrown, the Qing dynasty comes in and they try to get rid of everything Mongolian, right? So a return to the mandate of heaven after the Qing came back to power would probably be the only outside evidence that you really want to use from this document. Now, if whenever you were listening to this, you went, I didn't get any of that, that's okay, right? We are going to work at building to get better at this. But what you will notice, and what you should have gathered, is that all of these documents can be tied together. You just have to really take the time to read them and break them down, right? It doesn't take 10 minutes to read the documents that were on there. It probably only takes 4 or 5 minutes. You should spend those other 5 or 6 minutes literally just looking at it and going, what is this actually saying, right? What is actually important from this? And the most important thing that I can tell you is, if you look at one of these documents and you go, I don't know what this is. If you only do all of the things for 2 documents, if you source them, if you have evidence for your argument, if you have outside evidence from each one, if you build it towards your thesis, if you do so in a complex way, you can get 8 out of the 10 points using 2 documents. Now, I'm not recommending that, because if you mess up on one thing, you go all the way down to 3 points, right? So don't fall apart there, because if you mess up on one of the documents, you're going to be totally out of luck. But if you get to a point where you look at this and you go, I have no idea what this is, cool, skip it. Try to analyze the other 4. If you get to those other 4 and you're like, I have no idea what this one is either, that's okay. Then try to do it for the 3 documents. And if you are struggling and you only know anything about one of the documents, it's going to be really hard to get a passing score. You really need to take the time to read these, analyze these, and move forward with it. But it is important that if you have no idea about one of the documents after reading it and breaking it down, don't waste your time trying to figure it out. The scorers are given a specific rubric like this, where they're going to basically be told, here's 4 things that they could use to count. If it's something else, consult the table reader. But if it's not close, they're just going to not give you the point for it. So you really do need to be specific. You really do need to pull everything out of this document that you can, right? So at the end of this, I said, now score yourself. So mark each box with what you think you got right and add up your score. You don't have to submit this actual document. You'll notice I posted up a poll on Edsby. Some people have already actually filled it out. But simply go through it, see whether or not you think you got all these, tally up your score. And then once you've tallied up your score and everything else, you're simply going to go to Edsby, and then you will fill in this fun little poll that says, like, how do you think you did? 1 through 10, and then zeros at the end. I hope nobody got that. I made it this time so that way your votes are hidden, so that way you don't have to feel embarrassed if you feel like you did really bad. People won't know. The whole class won't be able to see who you are. So please don't feel like you have something to prove or to hide from anybody else. This is just for me to kind of get a grasp on how you think you're doing. The only way that I can give you real legitimate feedback is if you actually stop in and talk to me or ask me a question, right? So I'm on Zoom every day, right? Come in, ask any question you have. I will answer any question that you have, right? It's important that we actually take the time to get better at these. Again, and I cannot stress it enough, this is the only thing that the test is on. The test is just one of these. That's it. So there's nothing else to fret about. There's nothing else to stress about. This is what it is, right? So at this time, I'm going to stop the recording portion. And if people are here directly and want to ask questions, I will take questions from people. We'll talk about that. And I will post this up to YouTube later.